Hello, my name is Valeria, and I will be talking about why is it that current classical musicians no longer improvise. The first thing that comes to mind when you think of musical improvisation is probably jazz or blues. However, improvisation is a practice that is found in many musical traditions all over the world. Classical musicians are known today for performing music note for note as written in the score. However, this was not always the case. This may surprise you, but improvisation was a big part of music performance and training from the Middle Ages to the late 1800s. So, why are classical musicians no longer learning to improvise? Improvisation in classical music dates back to the Middle Ages. Soloists would add spontaneous embellishments to well-known melodies, and the provided score served as a skeleton for the melody over, which musicians would add their own variations. An example of melodic variation today might be found at a sporting event with the national anthem. For example, singers usually add in variations and fill in while keeping melody and lyrics recognizable. Classical musicians also improvise accompaniments to melodies. In fact, the first record of improvisation in Western music comes from 19th century writings that detail how to add counter melodies to Gregorian chants. Later, during the Baroque era, this type of improvised accompaniment became what is called the basso continuo. Probably the most widely known example of improvisation in classical music is the cadenza. If you are playing Mozart concerto, back in the day, towards the end, there's always a point where the harmony reaches a peak that everyone stops. And the pianist or whatever instrument will do a solo, basically on the themes from the main parts, and traditionally that was all improvised. So, how are classical musicians different from the 18th century to today? In the 18th century, a fully trained musician would have created new music constantly for every occasion. This was expected, and a fully trained musician would play at least the keyboard and maybe another one or two instruments, maybe be a singer, and would compose and conduct at the same time. There was no such thing as a fixed repertoire. They did not have a fixed repertoire, so there was no guide. They were playing new music all the time, and the primary purpose of studying old music was to gain insights from it. Back in the 18th century, nearly all keyboard music in ensembles was played from figured bass. 18th century keyboard players spent most of their time not reciting works from their repertoire, but completing works that were new in playing from the figured bass. The keyboardists spent their time participating in the construction of new and improvised music. So, let's go into further detail about what is figured bass. Figured bass is a shorthand method of composing. It was invented during the Baroque period, about 1800s to 1750s. In those days, composers only wrote out a melody and the bass line, and not only the middle parts. The melody was played or sung by a soloist, and the bass line was usually played on a keyboard instrument, such as a harpsichord or an organ. Obviously, the keyboard player needed to do a bit more than just play the bass line with his or her left hand. But where was the rest of the music? Well, he or she had to improvise. The composers added small numbers underneath the bass line, like a kind of code which told the player which chords to play. However, this code, which is the figured bass, didn't tell the player exactly how to play the chords. For example, they could choose to play them as solid chords, broken chords, or could wave them into heavily decorated individual voice lines. In fact, keyboard players in those days were judged on their ability to create amazing improvisations from a figured bass. And of course, the same piece of music would be played in totally different ways by different musicians. Now let's go ahead and talk about musicians nowadays. Today, musicians, most specifically piano musicians, focus on playing a replica of the pieces that were originally invented by famous classical composers such as Beethoven, Mozart, Chopin, amongst others. Classical music nowadays is performed at recitals for people to listen to and appreciate. The pieces that were performed are the same that have been performed for the last 200 years or more. Classical music has not been improvised and has no intent of evolving, since they sit there like works of art. Currently, musicians focus on learning the pieces note by note in order to recreate them. Why did improvisation disappear from classical music? Well, because all the composers wrote their own versions of cadenzas and other pieces, they would write it out to facilitate and help performers that were lesser improvisers back in the day to guide them through. Composers back in the days wanted cadenzas to be good, so they wrote one or several out, and then, because they would write them down, their music performers would just attach to that and just learn the same thing that was written down in the paper. The Industrial Revolution also created the middle class during the 19th century, and more people with spare money were interested in music performance and education. Instead of hiring professional musicians, middle-class families could now buy their own instruments and perform themselves. In addition, the increased availability of published sheet music provided more people with access to classical music. The 20th century also saw advancements in recording technology. Now that music performances could be recorded and replayed endlessly, the new reality led to the pursuit of perfection, which inevitably involved less spontaneity and less risk-taking. Recordings of famous works by composers such as Mozart and Beethoven were labeled as museum music, and improvised performances became less popular. Modern musicians have taken classical music to another level by mixing it up or by adding electronic music to it, this giving classical music a different perspective, yet it continues to be the same notes that have been played for hundreds of years. If a current musician decided to improvise on a classic piece of music, it would give the audience more spontaneity, and for the first time in most of their lives, they would be at a classical concert where they don't know what's going to happen next. Personally, I believe that improvisation is making a comeback in the classical music world, owing to the efforts of many modern composers, and this has certainly had an impact, as has looking to other genres such as jazz, flamenco, and folk music, which still embrace many forms of improvisation.